Mesa Verde was recently named another international dark sky park for the exceptional quality of its star-filled nights. It's already been designated as a World Heritage Site featuring the best preserved structures of the Pueblo people.
Everyone who comes to Mesa Verde looks up. They photograph the cliff dwellings tucked into the sandstone, marvel at the towers, and drive home certain they've seen the whole thing. They're wrong. The real Mesa Verde, the part that quietly rewrote what archaeologists thought they knew about the people who built it, was never up in those famous alcoves at all. It was sealed underground, directly beneath the feet of everyone who ever stood there gawking at the view. The city across the gorge. Picture the scene properly, because it matters. It's deep winter on the Mesa Verde Plateau, a high, green tableland cut through by steep sandstone canyons in the far southwest corner of Colorado. Richard Wetherill and his brother-in-law, Charlie Mason, aren't archaeologists. They're ranchers, out chasing stray cattle through the snow on December 18, 1888, when they ride up to the rim of a canyon and see, through the falling snow on the far side, an entire city built into a natural alcove in the cliff face. They named it Cliff Palace, and it's easy to understand why the name stuck. Towers, square rooms stacked 3 and 4 stories high, open plazas, walls of shaped sandstone fitted together by hands that had gone still roughly 600 years earlier. To 2 men on horseback in a snowstorm, it looked like a frozen city, abandoned for reasons nobody could name. What most visitors don't realize is that the Wetherills weren't first-time explorers stumbling into unknown territory blind. The family had been ranching this land for years and had almost certainly heard rumors from local Ute guides about ruins in the canyons, though it was Richard and Charlie who finally rode close enough to see one clearly. That first impression, the obvious one, the one almost anybody would form, is exactly what buried the real story for decades. Investigators read Mesa Verde like an ordinary town. Houses, roofs, streets. They looked at the architecture visible from across the canyon and assumed that was the whole point of the place. It wasn't. The most important rooms these people ever built weren't the towers catching the winter light. They were the round chambers sunk into the ground. And almost nobody who came to admire the Cliff City over the next several decades gave them a second glance. That same winter, the Wetherills kept exploring, picking their way along the canyon rims and finding dwelling after dwelling, places that would later carry names like Spruce Tree House and Square Tower House. In those first frozen weeks, the family had no way of knowing they were standing at the edge of something that would eventually pull in scientists, looters, and an entire nation's attention for the next 130-plus years. The place everyone thinks they know. Here's what we're actually dealing with, because the scale is genuinely hard to hold in your head. Mesa Verde is not one ruin. It's more than 4,700 recorded archaeological sites scattered across the mesa tops and canyon walls, including roughly 600 cliff dwellings. Cliff Palace, the one that made the postcards, is only the most famous face of something far larger, and at over 150 rooms, it remains the biggest cliff dwelling anywhere in North America. The people who built all of it are called the Ancestral Puebloans, and they weren't passing through. They settled this region as early as the 6th century CE, and archaeological evidence at nearby sites suggests farming communities were present even earlier, and they stayed for roughly 7 centuries. That's more than 20 generations of people being born, farming corn, beans, and squash on the mesa tops, raising children, burying their dead, and endlessly building against one of the more unforgiving landscapes on the continent. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the legislation establishing Mesa Verde as a national park, the first in the United States created specifically to preserve human-made structures rather than natural scenery, a distinction that mattered enormously given how badly the site had already been looted. That same year, Congress passed the Antiquities Act, a law drafted in significant part because of the outrage over what had already happened to Mesa Verde's artifacts. And in 1978, UNESCO named it one of the first World Heritage Sites on the planet. Almost everyone who visits does exactly what Wetherill and Mason did that day in the snow. They look up, photograph the cliff houses, and drive home believing they've seen it all. They've missed the heart of the place entirely because the center of this civilization was never up in the alcoves catching the sun. It was below the surface, waiting for someone to think, to look down. The first scientist in the ruins. It took a while for anyone to dig in the right direction. For a few years after 1888, Cliff Palace and its neighbors were mostly worked over by curiosity seekers hauling out pottery, textiles, and turquoise to sell to collectors back east. Then, in 1891, a young Swedish scientist named Gustaf Nordenskjöld arrived and did something almost no one had bothered to do. He treated the place as a site rather than a souvenir bin, measuring, photographing, and recording exactly where each object was found before removing it. Nordenskjöld's methods were genuinely ahead of their time, but his conclusion to the story adds a layer the source rarely gets told. He shipped roughly 600 artifacts back to Scandinavia. And when locals in Colorado discovered a foreigner was exporting their prehistoric heritage, the resulting public fury became one of the direct catalysts for the federal protections that followed. Nordenskjöld's own collection today sits in the National Museum of Finland in Helsinki, rather than anywhere in the United States. A strange and rarely mentioned footnote to a discovery that helped launch American archaeology as a serious discipline. His 1893 book, The Cliff Dwellers of the Mesa Verde, remains one of the foundational texts on the region. As careful, methodical excavations slowly spread across the mesa in the decades that followed, a strange pattern began to surface, or more precisely, to sink. The most significant structures excavators kept turning up weren't the visible houses at all. They were chambers built down into the earth, and the easy assumptions, storage pits, root cellars, kept collapsing the closer anyone looked. These were rooms built with something close to obsession, plastered, shaped, and returned to generation after generation. To understand why a society would pour its best work, you need exactly one word: kiva. What a kiva really was. A kiva is a room, usually circular, usually built partly or entirely below ground. Said flatly, it sounds almost dull. It's the furthest thing from it. The word itself comes from the Hopi language, and it's still in active use today among Pueblo communities, a linguistic thread running directly from the present back into these buried rooms. Anthropologists first began using the term systematically in the early 20th century, borrowing directly from living Hopi ceremonial vocabulary rather than inventing new archaeological jargon, precisely because Hopi elders were willing to explain what these spaces meant to researchers like Jesse Walter Fuchs, who documented active kiva use at Hopi villages in Arizona, decades before anyone fully understood the buried examples at Mesa Verde. In a Puebloan community, the kiva functioned as several of our buildings rolled into one. Religious ceremony happened there. So did community gatherings, political decisions, the education of the young, and ritual performance that held a village together. Take a church, a town hall, a courtroom, and a school, and bury all four inside one round room beneath the village floor. Archaeologists studying the broader region have also identified distinct scales of kiva, from small chambers built to serve a single extended family or clan, sometimes holding no more than a dozen people, up through the much larger great kivas meant for an entire settlement, a hierarchy suggesting these communities organized their spiritual life with the same layered structure they applied to kinship and governance. The kiva was deliberately cut off from ordinary daily life. People didn't cook supper there or store their belongings the way they did in their surface-level living rooms. The underground was held apart on purpose, reserved for something the daylight world wasn't permitted to touch. Which raises an obvious question. If these rooms had no ordinary door in the wall, how did anyone get inside? The descent. You went in through the roof. There was no door cut into the curved stone wall, no threshold to walk across at ground level. Instead, a small opening was cut directly into the ceiling, and a wooden ladder, often made from a single ponderosa pine trunk with notches carved for footholds, rose up through it into the open air above. You stepped on and descended backward into the dark, the same way people still climb down into active kivas at Hopi and other Pueblo villages today. The air changed first, cooler, closer, thick with wood smoke and packed earth, carrying a mineral stillness found nowhere else in the surface dwellings above. Your eyes needed a moment to adjust, and then the room resolved around you, and you understood immediately this was no crude cellar. At the center of the floor sat a fire pit, carefully lined and maintained across generations of use. The ash layers beneath many excavated kivas revealing decades or even centuries of continuous burning in the exact same spot. Near the base of the wall, a narrow vertical shaft was cut to draw fresh air down from the surface, and standing between that shaft and the fire, a single upright slab of stone functioned as a deflector, so the incoming draft broke around it and spread instead of blowing the flames flat. A solution so effective that early 20th century archaeologists studying the ruins initially struggled to explain how a room sealed this completely could sustain a fire at all without smothering it. Around the curved walls ran low benches, and rising from them, stone pilasters, sometimes 6 or more spaced evenly around the room, carried the weight of the heavy cribbed timber roof overhead, a structural technique built up in overlapping wooden layers rather than a single flat span. What you're looking at is a sealed underground room where a fire could burn clean and steady for hours, where smoke was pulled up and out through the same shaft, drawing in fresh air, and where the two currents kept circulating on their own without any mechanical assistance. Archaeoastronomers studying kiva construction have also noted that in several excavated examples, the placement of the ventilation shaft and the roof entry appear deliberately aligned to solar events, like the winter solstice, with sunlight from the entry hatch striking a specific point on the wall or the deflector stone only on that single day of the year, suggesting these builders weren't only solving an engineering problem, but timing their ceremonial spaces to the movement of the sun itself, likely anchoring seasonal ceremonies to the exact turning point of the agricultural calendar. These builders solved a ventilation puzzle underground 800 years ago that would make a modern contractor stop and think twice, using nothing but stone, air pressure, and an intimate working knowledge of how heat and draft move through an enclosed space. But of everything in that chamber, the fire, the benches, the engineered air, the single most important feature is also the one you'd most likely step over and never notice. The hole that was a doorway. It's a small hole, often no wider than a closed fist, cut into the floor near the central fire pit. It's called a sipapu, and you could spend an hour in that chamber and never register it as anything more than a flaw in the stone. It isn't a flaw. In the living traditions of modern Pueblo peoples, the direct descendants of the people who built all of this, the sipapu represents the place of emergence, the spot where the ancestors first climbed up into this world from the worlds that lay below. A meeting hall doesn't need a sacred emergence point carved into its floor. A storeroom doesn't need a portal to the world of the ancestors. This detail tells you these underground chambers were never merely practical. They held a community's deepest answers about where it came from. And the reason archaeologists can say that with any real confidence is that Pueblo communities, including the Hopi, Zuni, and the 19 Pueblo nations of the Rio Grande Valley, still carry the sipapu concept forward in their ceremonies and origin stories today. Meaning this interpretation isn't a guess reconstructed from broken pottery. It's living testimony. But the kiva, for all its power, wasn't the beginning of the story. To find where the underground really starts, you have to dig past the kivas entirely. before the cliffs. Here's something that genuinely catches most visitors off guard. The famous cliff dwellings came late, near the very end of the story, not the beginning. The earliest ancestors of these people didn't live in stone towers at all. They lived in pit houses, homes dug into the ground and roofed over, half-buried dwellings where daily life unfolded literally inside the earth. Before a single cliff structure was ever built, these people were already living underground. That pull toward the below was there from the very start. Over generations, those plain pit houses slowly changed, taking on features that had nothing to do with cooking or sleeping, and everything to do with ceremony. Archaeologists call this transitional stage the protokiva, an evolutionary bridge between an ordinary buried home and a sacred buried chamber. Given enough centuries, the protokiva develops into the formal circular kiva scattered across Mesa Verde today. Researchers working at Chaco Canyon, roughly 90 miles south in New Mexico, and connected to Mesa Verde through shared trade networks, and some archaeologists argue shared political influence, have documented an even larger version of this evolution. The so-called Great Kivas, chambers up to 60 feet across capable of holding hundreds of people at once, suggesting this underground tradition scaled up dramatically as Puebloan society grew more complex. Most ancient cultures leave a scatter of broken pieces and a great deal of guessing. Mesa Verde left an entire slow transformation stacked in layered dirt like the pages of a book. And in one spot beneath Cliff Palace, that underground world was hiding a connection nobody saw coming. The tunnel under Cliff Palace. Cliff Palace holds more than 20 kivas woven among its buildings. And somewhere in the long work of excavating that place, investigators found something unexpected. 2 of those kivas are connected, not by a doorway or a path across an open plaza, but by a tunnel running underground through rock and packed rubble, secretly linking one ceremonial chamber directly to another. The discovery itself traces back to the site's first major stabilization campaign. In 1909, ethnologist Jesse Walter Fuchs, working under the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, led the excavation and repair of Cliff Palace, clearing centuries of rubble and collapsed masonry from rooms the weatherills had only glimpsed. It was during this systematic clearing, far more thorough than anything attempted in the 2 decades since the site's discovery, that the connecting passage between the 2 kivas was fully exposed and documented for the first time, though its purpose was debated from the very beginning. Why the tunnel exists remains genuinely unsettled after well over a century of study. The leading interpretation is dramatic. Picture a ceremony underway in one kiva, the room packed with people, firelight on the curved stone walls, and a figure who seemed to vanish from that chamber only moments earlier, suddenly rising up from the floor of the kiva next door, as though he'd traveled through the underworld itself. In a culture whose most sacred architecture was built around a doorway to the worlds below, a hidden passage letting a performer disappear and reappear would have been a staggering effect, one that fits almost too well with the Sipapu's own symbolism of emergence made physical. But that remains a hypothesis, a careful, reasonable, even beautiful guess, not a confirmed fact. Maybe the passage moved air. Maybe it served a purpose, lost to us entirely. Some researchers have pointed to similar connecting tunnels documented at other ancestral Puebloan sites in the Mesa Verde region, including at Longhouse and Balcony House, and archaeologist Earl Morris, who conducted extensive excavation work across the Four Corners region in the 1920s and 1930s, noted comparable subterranean passages at sites well beyond Mesa Verde itself, suggesting whatever purpose these passages served may have been a broader, shared architectural practice rather than a one-off feature unique to Cliff Palace. That regional pattern only deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. One chamber for every few families. When archaeologists got serious about counting rooms across Mesa Verde, a ratio jumped out. Across many communities, researchers found roughly one kiva for every 5 or 6 living rooms, a figure first quantified in systematic room counts conducted during the early 20th century and refined repeatedly since through later surveys of the park's smaller, less famous sites. These ceremonial chambers weren't rare or reserved for a handful of priests. They were everywhere. Nearly every cluster of a few households had its own underground sacred room, and on top of those family-scale kivas, some communities also built the larger Great Kivas, capable of gathering an entire settlement at once. Structures that at sites like Chaco Canyon, roughly 90 miles to the south, could reach 60 feet across and hold several hundred people simultaneously. At Chaco's Pueblo, Bonito alone, archaeologists have identified multiple Great Kivas, serving what was, by the 11th century, one of the largest built complexes in North America. Evidence that this underground architectural tradition scaled dramatically as Puebloan society grew more interconnected across the wider Southwest. What this tells us is that the spiritual world and the everyday world at Mesa Verde were never kept in separate buildings on opposite ends of a settlement. They were stacked directly on top of one another. People ground corn and mended sandals just a few feet above the rooms where that same community met its gods. Compare that to how most complex societies organize belief. We build our sacred spaces big, central, and apart. A cathedral on a hill, a temple at the heart of a city. A single grand structure meant to be seen from a distance and approached with ceremony. Anthropologists studying the ancestral Southwest have specifically contrasted this with the more centralized, hierarchical temple systems found in contemporaneous Mesoamerican civilizations to the south, where religious authority was concentrated in a small number of monumental structures controlled by an elite priestly class. These people did the opposite. They tucked the sacred beneath the ordinary, distributed in dozens of small chambers rather than concentrated in one. So holiness wasn't a destination you traveled to on special days. It was the floor below your floor, a few rungs of a ladder away at any hour, embedded in the architecture of daily life rather than set apart from it. For roughly 7 centuries, this arrangement worked. Then, within the span of a generation or two, all of it stopped. What the machines see now. Before we get to why, here's how researchers now study these fragile rooms without wrecking them in the act of looking. For the longest time, the only way to learn anything from a kiva was to dig it up, and every dig cost something that could never be recovered. That's changed, and it's changed fast. Researchers today increasingly walk in carrying instruments instead of shovels. LiDAR scanners fire thousands of laser pulses to build flawless 3-dimensional models of entire structures. Drones reach angles no person could safely climb to. And photogrammetry stitches together hundreds of overlapping photographs into an exact digital twin that can be studied on a screen. One of the earliest large-scale efforts of this kind came in 2003, when the nonprofit digital preservation group SciArc partnered with the park to laser scan Cliff Palace in its entirety, producing one of the first complete 3-dimensional archives of any ancestral Puebloan site, a dataset now used as a permanent baseline against which any future structural change can be measured. The National Park Service, in partnership with organizations including the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, has used exactly these tools over the past 2 decades to monitor structural stability across the park's most fragile alcove sites, identifying leaning walls and shifting foundations long before they'd be visible to the naked eye. We can now study a kiva down to the width of a fingernail without laying a hand on it, and flown over the wider landscape, these same tools can pick out the faint shapes of field systems and structures that centuries of brush and soil had completely swallowed, extending the visible footprint of the ancestral world far past the boundaries of the park itself. And yet, for all that laser-scanned, drone-flown precision, the machines keep circling back to one question they cannot answer. The very question Wetherill and Mason wrote into the historical record in 1888 without realizing it. Why is this astonishing place completely empty? The Great Leaving. Because they did leave. All of them. Sometime around the end of the 13th century. And they didn't drift off slowly across generations. Within a generation or two, the entire region emptied out. For a long time, that looked like an outright vanishing, which is exactly where the spookier theories come from. The real picture is more grounded and, honestly, more interesting. We have a remarkable tool for peering into those exact years, and it comes from an unexpected place. Trees. In the early 20th century, an astronomer named Andrew Ellicott Douglas, originally studying tree rings to understand sunspot cycles and their effect on climate, pioneered the science of dendrochronology, learning to read wide rings from good growing years against the thin, pinched rings of drought years. Douglas would go on to found the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona in 1937, and the timber pulled from Mesa Verde's own roof beams became some of the founding data behind the entire scientific field. That timber told a brutal story. The rings reveal a severe, grinding drought settling over the region across the final decades of the 1200s, a period tree ring researchers now call the Great Drought. For a society that lived and died by corn grown on the mesa tops, that wasn't an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. And there's a detail in the timeline that makes it stranger still. The famous cliff dwellings, the towers and alcoves the world now pictures whenever it hears the name Mesa Verde, were mostly built late, in roughly the final 100 years of occupation. These people didn't spend 7 centuries living in the cliffs. For most of their history, they lived on the open mesa tops, and only near the end did they pull back into defensible alcoves, hauling stone and timber into tight overhangs to build the most spectacular architecture they ever produced, right as everything around them was falling apart. People don't usually retreat into a cliff face for the view. They do it for protection. Drought alone almost certainly doesn't explain the whole thing. After 700 years of dense settlement, the land itself was likely worn thin. Forests cut back for fuel and roof beams, soils exhausted, game hunted down. Some sites from those final years show unmistakable signs of conflict. And beneath it all, there may have been a deeper unraveling still. Social strain, religious upheaval, a slow sense that the old ways centered on those sacred underground rooms had stopped holding the world together. Here is the single most important thing to understand, and it's precisely what the lost civilization crowd conveniently leaves out. These people did not vanish. They migrated south and east, toward the Rio Grande and the lands of the Hopi and the Zuni, and their descendants are alive today. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest are the living children of Mesa Verde. They carried the Sipapu, the Kivas, and the old stories of emergence with them when they went. So the real mystery was never where everyone went. We have a fairly solid idea of that. The mystery that still keeps archaeologists awake is why they left so completely, and why they never once returned to live inside these cities again. The real hidden world. So let's clear up the thing some of you have been bracing for. There is no lost city hidden under Mesa Verde, no vast secret metropolis carved into the bedrock, no site-wide network of tunnels stitching the canyons together into a sprawling underground kingdom. If a video somewhere has tried to sell you that, it isn't real. The truth is the better story anyway, because there absolutely is a hidden world beneath Mesa Verde. It's simply not the one the myths promised. It's a world of kivas and proto-kivas, and ancient pit houses, of great communal chambers, and one genuinely strange tunnel beneath Cliff Palace, of a small sacred hole in a floor that meant more than any tower standing in the sun. This was a civilization that made a deliberate choice to put the most important parts of itself below the surface, its beliefs, its origins, its gods, and to build its visible cities almost as an afterthought, stacked on top. That's the thing Wetherill and Mason couldn't possibly see across the gorge in the falling snow in 1888. That's the thing the souvenir hunters dug right past on their way to the pottery. The real Mesa Verde was never the breathtaking houses set into the cliff. It was the quiet, engineered, sacred dark underneath them, and bringing that into the light completely rewrote what we thought we knew about one of the greatest civilizations North America ever produced. If you came all the way down here with me, you're exactly who this channel was built for. So go ahead and subscribe, because there are a lot more buried stories where this one came from. And I'll leave you with the question I can't stop turning over in my own head. If an entire civilization could hide its true heart underground for 700 years,